it so much you may even get tired of winning.
Are you expecting a recession this year?
I hate to predict things like that. There is a period of transition. It takes a little time.
Welcome to Is It Bad for the Economy, the podcast where we interrogate Trump's economic policies to figure out whether they're helping, hurting, or just a load of hot air. My name is Kobi Tirey, Democratic strategist, trying to figure out how Democrats can finally get the credit they deserve for outperforming Republicans on the economy for essentially my entire lifetime. And I'm joined by the fantastic anonymous financial practitioner, Banker Bill, who's doing some great work at a bank you've definitely heard of. And we're also joined by our second ever guest, Nick Giometti, AI engineer, AI investor. Let's go, he said when I asked him for his title. Technically, he's the senior principal at B Capital. Nick and I go all the way back to elementary school, but technically we also took Econ 101 in college. He tried his best to keep me from embarrassing myself, but ultimately he was not successful. It was actually his idea to come on to this show because he is seriously concerned about the effects that AI could and will have on employment. He thinks it's going to come a little faster than you might think.
Okay, yeah, of course, ask the Silicon Valley investor with, deep rose tinted glasses about a less saccharine take on the world. For a while, I've been hearing, the pounding of the drum that we're going to have the fully automated enterprise. There were McKinsey studies that came out 15 years ago that said in 10 years, we're going to have X number of jobs displaced despite an increase in GDP. And I think we all waited those 10 years and we said, why isn't the fully automated enterprise here? Now we have the AGI race, so artificial general intelligence race, and saying we're going to have models capable of doing any job generally well, and everyone's going to get a job. I guess what I would say here is that I am as skeptical as the next person of one model to rule them all. We're already starting to see some scaling limits of the performance of models, but I think I'm fairly rational in saying that AI is now really good at certain tasks, right? AI has been really good and much better at humans for certain tasks for a long time, but it's now how well we can orchestrate them together. And so what I get scared about, I would say, is we're at a moment in intelligence, particularly in domains where you have verifiable outcomes. And what do I mean by that? It's like 1 + 1 = 2. I can verify that. I can use all sorts of mathematical proofs to show you that that is true. And if I look at where I'm starting to see the canary in the coal mine for impact, real labor impact, I would say it's in these verifiable domains. The first one, surprisingly, is coding. And coding, you think about how it works, you essentially have these things called compilers. And compilers will allow you to write some code and you run it and the code either works or it doesn't. When it doesn't, it spits out an error and says, hey, it failed for this reason. And it's not that you'd say, hey, 100% of software is cooked. No, but I do think there are parts, and we see this in benchmarks of comparing AI responses versus humans. We have this thing like SWE-bench. It's a benchmark of looking at software engineering and the performance of relative models. And AI is starting to beat very senior developers. It's winning international competitions. It's beating some of the best human developers ever. And that's scary to me because while it's not perfect at everything, we are now starting to see this hit real labor stats on this, right? And so you could say there's the Stanford Digital Economy Lab run last August that's saying there's a 20% employment decline for jobs for people in the ages of 22 to 25 in AI. The junior level dev tasks are being really hit, right? There's another one, Harvard, the Hosseini-Lichtenberg study also similarly, 9 to 10% junior employment drop for AI adopting firms, right? And this is scary to me because, okay, yes, the capabilities, verifiable domains, things that AI has already been good at, which is retrieval, summarization, generation of reports on top of that. That looks like not 100% of our jobs, but a lot of our jobs. And what happens to the percent of jobs at stake when people have to just be really good at that 20% remaining? How many people will be responsible for doing that? So I guess for me, we're starting to hit this frontier of really strong performance in certain capabilities. And it's not just those verifiable domains. It's not just, do I have a compiler? Is it math? Is it science? Is it coding? We're starting to see it for other softer domains.
Just to summarize that quickly, if I'm understanding you correctly, what you're saying is that if you look at the world and you look at all of the tasks, primarily digital software tasks, where the outcome is a very direct, concrete result of the work put in, you can test objectively whether it's right or wrong. If you take all those jobs, AI is starting to knock all of them out of the park. The list is starting to get a little thin. of ones that it hasn't solved for yet.
I think that's fair. And let me caveat first, right? There are a lot of now emerging studies that, hey, we've had a couple years of AI writing code, and now we need all the people that we're saying we're going to not hire. We actually need more because they need to refactor and fix all that jank, right? There are dissenting views here. But anecdotally, and in the stats that I'm seeing, increasingly more so, a lot of what devs are spending their time on, it's not just, here, write base level code for me. It is now getting into higher order magnitude level thinking. Give me the rubric, right? And anything looks like a rubric, like a score, is a reward. These rewards are used to train models. So again, not going too much further down to the science of this, we have more data that is being paid for, that is being generated to get closer to emulate those more subjective tasks. And as we get closer to the reasoning, that's a narrower margin of what humans are needed for. That's what scares me, I guess. What happens to the share of power being allocated to labor versus capital? And there are a couple interesting pieces, you can link them in here, talking about like the intelligence curse, which talk about what happens when you take all of the power and shift it 100% to capital versus labor. Even in UBI, everyone's kind of stuck at their current level of income. I spent a lot of time thinking about the acceleration of income inequality. And I think you look at, I'm going to butcher the names, I apologize in advance, the Acemoglu and Restrepo paper published in NBER and Econometrica back in 2022. And it was looking at the inequality of incomes driven by automation, right? Particularly from a time period of, I think it was like 82 to 2016. And their finding was, depending on the amount of kind of middle skill or routine tasks that you were doing, anywhere from 50 to 70% of the increase in income inequality was due to automation. The jumps are stark, like 10% increases in income inequality. That's a period ending a decade ago. And now we're seeing transformer-based models and multimodal reasoning models and continuous improvement and continuous learning models. I would love to see the updated version of this. And I think you take it to ad absurdum, right? So what can we do in advance of this? And I think the reason for me wanting to come on.
There's an alternate model for the effects that AI could have, that LLMs could have on employment. And this is an article I found from Planet Money. It's called Generative AI at Work. It's from two MIT economists, Daniel Lee, Lindsay Raymond, and a man with a Scandinavian name I'm going to try to pronounce, and it's not going to go well, Eric Brynjolfsson. And just to take from the abstract quickly, they looked at 5,172 customer support agents. They had access to AI assistants, and less experienced and lower skill workers improve both the speed and quality of their output, while the most experienced and highest skilled workers see small gains in speed and small declines in quality. While AI systems improve with more training data, we find that the gains from AI adoption are largest for moderately rare problems where human agents have less baseline experience, but the system still has adequate training data. Finally, we provide evidence that AI assistance improves the experience of work along several dimensions. Customers are more polite and less likely to ask to speak to a manager. Why are we trying to replace jobs instead of giving everybody a supercomputer in their pocket that all of a sudden makes them rock stars at their jobs? And just this customer support thing is really resonating with me because my identity got stolen. Last year, a fraudulent tax return was filed on my behalf. I had to deal with corporations to resolve that. I had to deal with the federal government to resolve that. Dealing with the government was so much better than dealing with any of the corporations. The federal workers knew what they were doing. If there was something weird, they knew how to resolve it. If they didn't, they went and asked their manager, came back in 5 minutes with a real answer. Why aren't we using AI to turn every customer support agent into a superhuman instead of trying to replace them?
I don't disagree with you in the same way that we got calculators and now math didn't go away. We just were able to do math faster and more advanced math. I guess the question is, to what extent is the human plus the AI and the scale of that necessary for what the objective of that company and the product would be? How many of those people are needed? I would love for everyone to be the augmenter. Let's write 100% more code, create more products, and do all these things and innovate. And I think there's a huge, huge potential for AI to uplift, right? But I'm now just trying to figure out what the incentive is. But as we get closer to embedding this in your workflow, for example, now we have these things called MCP apps, Model Context Protocol application. I can render a PowerPoint slide live in ChatGPT, and I can make those edits. And so the next time it say, hey, generate a report on economic inequality or whatever, and it starts making these figures and I edit those live, it's going to commit that to memory. We're getting more specificity and more of what it means for Nick to do work gets encoded. And if we accelerate that for every job, for every type of embedded workflow, we're showing the models how to get better. We are the training data. That's part of your job that is now at stake.
I would add a couple things from my professional experience. AI gives me a lot of first or second year, I would say, on the job output. In my industry, in financial services, that means recent graduates, I would say, are highly capable. So let's say B plus, A minus students may now be competing with AI for the same role. And I think that your talk about the meaning of work and how we'll do work and how it's encroaching into these exact type of roles resonates with me because I'm seeing in my own professional experience how we are being encouraged to use AI in our workflows, how it's part of our performance feedback on how often we're accessing and using the AI in our workflows. And I'm sure that the firm is using all of that as training data.
This kind of goes back to our daddy and savior of the economy right now, Jensen from NVIDIA, his comment that AI is not going to replace your job. It's people who use AI. I think everyone should probably get better at using these tools and understand how you drive them, right? What does the upskilling like that look like? And this is what's hard because I went on a hunt to say upskilling works across the board. These are the examples of time where we had very large government sponsored programs for upskilling. And there's a little bit of economic inconsistency here. But I will say, compared to other G7 countries, we are spending far less as a percentage of our total GDP on upskilling and reskilling.
As a general matter or as it relates to the impacts of AI?
As a general matter, for sure.
Yeah.
And I
Okay,
think
sure.
particularly, what is the GI AI bill, right? What would that look like? And now I realize that was
Interesting concept.
when we had a commitment to, hey, I can go to college for free. I'm going to have all of these incentives for me to become educated, to be a contributing member of the workforce here. And now I'm saying, okay, what does it mean to have this massive acceleration of value of capital? And how do we make sure that it is still being distributed so that there are people to keep paying for all the products? As a consumer, it's great. I am able to have cheaper and better access and higher quality because of AI on many things, right? But if I don't have a job to pay for things, to pay for that AI, what's the point? And so I guess my question is, how do we preserve this balance between capital and labor? And what are ways that we could actually start thinking about upskilling and reskilling? And I know taxation is a very dirty word, and I don't want to disincentivize innovation by any means. But I am curious about, would that not long-term benefit everyone to learn how to use these tools? I mean, wouldn't that perfectly align with these AI companies that, hey, I want more and more people to get value from it. I want people to become entrepreneurs, to create their own companies, to create new products. It seems like that would be a flywheel effect, not one that would potentially stifle innovation.
I think this argument cuts both ways, but I'd like to hear what your reaction to it is. How do you prevent that from being another miners need to learn how to code moment? If everybody learned how to code when Hillary Clinton told us to in 2016, a lot of folks would be out of a job or maybe struggling to advance in their careers right now if they'd made that switch then. On the one hand, yeah, let's tax Silicon Valley. Let's spend a whole bunch of money educating people. Isn't that how you're supposed to solve the problem? You just move on to the next thing. On the other hand, isn't AI moving so quickly that if we trained everybody in AI today, how long do we actually think that training would be relevant?
I think that is a perfectly fair question, Kobi. And I do not want to say, oh, like this sounds like a great policy and it's going to work immediately. And the people who are out of job are immediately going to have, new ones. And I'll probably make a lot of enemies by saying the people that become unemployed are really going to be underemployed because they're going to shift to gig work. And we should have reclassification of gig workers and protections on that. That's a very unpopular opinion in some companies in my field. But the thing that I would say on a blanket basis is it better to do that now versus tomorrow?
And we don't know. So why not do it today?
I think so. What's the harm in making sure we have a social safety net?
Got no argument from me there.
I wish this could be a bipartisan thing, right?
Part of the reason I struggle with so much with this is this sort of, I wonder what you think of the phrase, but this tech feudalism idea.
Yeah.
That right now, everybody is pulling every trick in the book to control as much of this technology, to control as much of the market share, to make sure there's integrated vertically with everybody else in the space across the hardware, across the software. It doesn't seem like anybody is chasing profit. Banker Bill, you talked about how people were being judged in their performance reviews on how often they used AI. There's a part of me that goes, okay, that's great. Let's make everybody learn this stuff the way that Nick's talking about. On the other hand, doesn't that make the software, that value added, a little questionable if this is something that's being forced on people as opposed to something that's being adopted in sort of that free market on paper capitalist way that we all kind of like to think that innovation happens? Am I foolish for wanting to return to a world where profit dominates the stock market as opposed to hype and potential?
Two things. First, the stock market, equity markets are always built on hype and dreams. Your risk is the source of future returns. The second thing you raised was about the companies that are requiring this to be used, that very well could be a business decision, because I imagine the companies that are implementing this enterprise-wide, they're spending a fortune on this and they're going to force adoption. So the only way to force adoption is put it in a performance review. Because even if your manager requires you to do something, if it's not in your performance review, frankly, a lot of people do not care. So now that you build it in as, let's say, a scorecard item, you're forcing the adoption, you're forcing the investment you've now made into this to be at least utilized or onboarded. I think that could be the driving factor.
Are there any sort of like really standard seatbelt, like non-controversial rules of the road, consumer protections you think we could implement right now to at least get some guardrails on this that are going to help people either as a consumer or in terms of maintaining folks' economic agency?
I do think having the notification this was created by AI is very important. Remember that this is the worst it's ever going to be. And I think of the memes of Will Smith eating pasta, that the AI video there and how ridiculous it looked, versus now we have some pretty good examples of it where it's a deep fake that you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. So I think being able to say, hey, know what you're consuming. You have a right to knowledge of this is an AI generated response, because I think that protects the quality and what you're paying for as a consumer. Fair. The next, I think alignment and just protecting basic human decency, right? I won't name names about certain model providers, but I think a couple had massive backlash about sexually explicit images generated of underage people, right? Taking their likeness as a seed to generate explicit content on top of that should never be allowed, right? That is just basic safety that I wonder why we even have to ask, should there be a guardrail around this? But yes, I think throttling of models too is interesting. Like, hey, a certain user base is only going to be able to have access to certain type of models. We already see this kind of past a certain usage amount. I do wonder, are we going to have a bit of like, only the hyper privileged, those who pay for the ultimate speed lane are going to have right to the best data or best models here. And I think practically speaking, let's talk about some really good organizations out there. Greg Leppard from the Harvard Institutional Data Initiative, which is run through the Harvard Kennedy School of Law, is spending a lot of time trying to think about what is fair access for data, right? If I'm a very small startup trying to train models, what does it mean to have a competitive fight against labs that are paying hundreds of millions of dollars for experts to provide that? What would it mean if Harvard wanted to take the results of their PhDs, dissertations, and whatnot, and basically canonize that as a set that should be open to even the playing field? Or let's say, hey, I wanted to spend money right now to convert non-English languages into corpuses that models can be trained on, so we don't have English language imperialism, essentially. Those are very interesting ways to protect consumers, to make sure that we have a fair and biased access to information that isn't going to one more powerful source than another. We didn't talk about also, what should we be having our kids learn? What's the value of education in a post-labor market and all this stuff?
The thought of being a college student today and having to decide how much am I going to use this technology to make me a better student versus how much I'm going to offload the work of being a student to this machine. What's my personal discipline going to be about that in order to best serve me and my education? That seems so hard to make an 18, 19, 20-year-old decide on a moment-to-moment basis.
Yeah, I think the skills, again, that I think are going to be valuable, regardless of whether or not AI takes all jobs or not, but like critical thinking, right? I think being able to look at a problem, use first principles to understand what are the implications of my actions here, what could have led to us getting here, what will happen if I make this choice, what's the unwind cost of that? Those are like invaluable skills to have, regardless of what domain you're in. And then I also understand the reason why I studied economics is a little bit of systems design, right? We have all these different factors that we have to weigh, and we have a lever. What happens? What are the incentives behind those levers? Can we model behavior around it? Is there some game theory we can think about? And I'm not saying that AI in some technocracy is going to have a better economic predictor. I think that was the literal, spoiler alert, plot line of Fallout 3, right? There's an AI that has run the country and the whole world has gone to shit. But I think systems design, right? It's going to be how we humans interact in a world where we have this, let's say, general intelligence or super intelligence. Well, we still have to interact with each other. How we allocate time, land, capital, labor, all these things are still going to be human problems. And I do worry there are probably some in the same ways that search engines change the way we had long-term memory versus procedural memory versus retrieval-based memory and all that stuff. There's probably going to be some impact to all of this. I am curious, maybe there is a positive case where we don't have to have screens anymore. We have voice agents or different interfaces for interacting that would get us away from just doing everything in screens. Because like fundamentally, what are we doing? Moving data into a CRM. What's the purpose of life? Should we be spending time just moving data from one system to another? That is a larger conversation. We could talk about like the very positive utopia case of what happens when you have an extreme overabundance. But I'm trying to ground it in a realistic approach that your listeners would want to hear, not just some full-on AGI pilled techno idiot from San Francisco.
For me, this approach, this systems engineering approach, I feel like as a liberal, as a Democrat, I should love it. But I'm worried that there is a top-down decision-making process that is a very high risk. And to me, that is not a reflection on the technology, because we could go in a very democratic direction with this technology. We've heard that China has this radically different approach to AI where they're going for efficiency as opposed to a catch-all model. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that. But we have the system in this country of, okay, the companies are getting too big. We got to split them up so they're fighting with each other, as opposed to what we're getting now with the circular investing, with the integration between all these different companies, where y'all are making these decisions. And if that's an unfair assessment, I'd be interested to hear why it's unfair. But isn't this a little too top-down?
You are seeing more and more labs emerge here because there are opinionated bets on the future that, hey, there are scaling laws. And by scaling law, I mean I'm saying, hey, I can't just throw more data doing the same thing we've done before and expect better performance. There are a lot of really smart scientists that are saying, yeah, let's try a new approach. Hey, let's explore self-improving models, or let's look at not just text-based transformers. We're going to use multimodal models. And so I'm going to use images and language encoding together to make better responses here. Or I'm going to spend time looking at the art of conjecture and formal verifications outside of things like math or science domains. How do I get better at these things? And so more and more, we are seeing new types of intelligence and competitive types of intelligence emerge. So I think it's not just the arms race for the one model rule. The labs themselves are seeing, hey, Anthropic's really good at coding. Yes, I need to be really good at coding, but maybe I'm Gemini. I'm going to be cracked at image generation. And Nano Banana, hilarious name, is just unbelievably good, fast, and cheap at generating images. And OpenAI is very good at coding. It's really good at code review. Codex is phenomenal at that. It's good at fixing your errors for you. It's really good at long horizon workflows. So I'm going to have an agent go off and run for 20 minutes and spit out a bunch of different reasoning traces, or basically show your work for a long time and use that to solve problems. So we are seeing different flavors of intelligence because now we have different sets of data that people are training these and different, approaches to do it. There was just so much low-hanging fruit for everyone to get up to this kind of baseline. And we are seeing it. You mentioned China. There are some really impressive models coming out of that ecosystem right now. Kimi K 2.5 from this lab called Moonshot AI just came out with a model this week that hit a 76 on Bench, right? Like the most important, the most well-known software engineering bench, compared to like an 81 from the GPT 5.2 model, which spent, as we know, billions of dollars a year to train. And so we are seeing kind of a democratization of intelligence. And I think that does create an incentive for people to find new approaches to being very competitive at solving different types of problems. What does scare me is there a market where we hit the singularity where models can train themselves to be better? OpenAI came out with this tool this week called Prism, which is basically a workspace for scientists to conduct research on ChatGPT and do the kind of conjecture to train new types of models. And do we eventually get so good at discovery that intelligence trains itself and then it's all endgame after that? That's one potential. I'm skeptical of the immediacy of that. And so in the meantime, the race is on.
What does that mean? It's all endgame after that?
I mean, I'm saying that's a super intelligence. That's all labor is displaced because AI can solve any problem. Right. And I think, again, we talked about
it. So that's where you're going down, where, money becomes worthless.
Right. And I think we're a long way from that. There are people that are more AGI pilled. Again, I personally don't think AGI in that definition is shifting every single year too, right? Because there are things that models are unbelievably much better at humans, right? They've far surpassed super intelligence, right? So I don't, again, want to get caught on AGI. And I think it's more about there's an incentive for every company to have a highly contextualized intelligence, not general, right? My product plus AI is better than me just renting a model from a mega lab. And in that world, when all that capital is being put to work, I think we have thousands of companies that have an incentive to be really good at solving either their existing problem or new ones. Old problem plus AI equals new product, right? So I think there is still a very big case for this non-agglomeration, this non-ultra concentration. I think we should watch out for the ultra concentration. And we've seen plenty of acqui-hiring, right? Researchers leave to build amazing new research offshoots and they get absorbed back into the mothership. That happens. But I also feel like we should be incentivizing those folks to go and leave and do that because being acqui-hired is a good outcome for them too, right? And I want to incentivize the innovation that happened along the way. Like that someone spending the couple $100 million to train a model to do something novel. If it gets bought back in, they probably couldn't have done that if they were at that mega lab. So I'm not necessarily opposed. I am pro-acquisition in some ways, I think it's just very important that we don't let all of the power go to just a few, or if it is, we find the right way to create backstop.
And it sounds like what you're saying is that from the inside looking out, from you on the ground in this community, you're seeing a ton of competition. You're seeing a ton of players. It's just the big ones are the ones that we're hearing about in the news and who are having the consumer facing effects.
Yeah, I mean, listen, like some interesting things, and I don't want to name drag, but we're seeing the heads of research at very large name brand labs leaving and starting new things. We saw this last year with the CTO of a lab leaving and starting a $50 billion valuation company. And then there was some infighting in the last couple of weeks where you had that person go back to the mothership and now they're the head of product there. So there is competition. There are very opinionated differences of researchers, and it is kind of like baseball, right? We're seeing these researchers go trade around for salaries that are $100 million over 4 years. That there is kind of an interesting shift towards power of labor, but it's a very, very select, concentrated set of labor.
Right. It's a specific specialization pays the most. And you kind of just alluded to that very thing in the model development. One I want to touch on is you mentioned competitive types of different models. Can you add any color concerning the use of AI or specific models for sovereign use cases? So what I'm referring to is allowing AI from a government perspective, either through direct or indirect surveillance that could be used for not just prosecution. That'd be the worst case, right? I'm talking about using AI at a governmental level to facilitate municipal activities, tax collection, water management, power, et cetera. There's all these different competitive use cases that are hyper specialized. What can you tell us about those use cases or potential use cases in a sovereign place?
Okay, let me be very clear here. Let's take away morality. Let's take away privacy.
But we could back that out.
Let's kind of go science here, right? Data is the mother of AI. Surveillance equals more data. The finer grained surveillance you have, the more we're able to observe not just the action, but we understand why it was done. And if you had a society that there was perfect transparency around every decision, why it was made, and how those decisions ripple throughout a person's life, and how that ripples into all the different people they interact with. I mean, that's what we kind of describe as like a world model, right? It's like I understand not only language, but actions and interactions, physics, and all of these different concepts. If you have perfect observation of that and perfect collection of data for that, I mean, that's an insane set as a proxy for intelligence. Now, we're bound by computers' abilities to transform the observed data into some type of meaning. That's what we say transformers. We're taking some information and transforming it into machine readable format using basically matrix multiplication. And that's why a lot of highly skilled math people are getting paid $75 million a year because they study their tensors and whatnot. But I worry, are we going to lose the race as a society compared to some other large governments that are okay with observing and encroaching on that? And now we can synthetically generate that, right? And I think maybe it only matters for as long as models are not as good at generating synthetic data. And by that, I mean model creates data that it then trains on itself. That's already starting to happen now, right? Here's an example of this. I can take a picture of me and then I can make 20 different variations of me. And that would now be like 20 new sets of examples to train on. Now, to overgeneralize, it doesn't always work that way. And there's things called model collapse, but models are getting better, let's just say, at training themselves or generating data needed to train themselves. And in that case, you'd see a limit in the value of a surveillance state, right? But in that case, well, it is kind of scary because now we're getting closer to that world where the self-training models get to the singularity and value of labor is zero, value of capital is everything. But now you have a second question about what's the right of AI to permeate civic functions, right? And I, again, would say, listen, let's make sure we have very strong guardrails around that. Because the way we train models, if I think about fine-tuning or training, one side effect is we can memorize. Am I going to take everyone's social security numbers and everyone's disability status into some model to generalize or to improve the base performance of a model? If it memorizes that, what does that do for my own protections, for my own privacy? How easy would it be to impersonate someone else?
Isn't that what happened with those?
There's plenty of information you could find about the current use of AI being allowed into sensitive information.
There was a big headline about Grok in the military this week.
That's a headline you could for sure read about.
And we will.
To me, I'm somebody who thinks that there is an incredibly optimistic direction for this technology to go in. I don't see that reflected by the decisions that are being made by the industry leaders that we recognize as laymen just watching the news. You clearly are coming at this with an incredibly strong moral conscience. And as somebody who's known you for a very, very long time, that does not surprise me in the slightest. Forget about the technology, forget about politics. Culturally, what is something you hope that the layman, the consumer, the voter, a value they carry in themselves about AI that will allow us to build a culture around using this technology responsibly? What is a moral principle, as small as it might be, that you've internalized, that's a check that you use to say, this is a good use of AI. This one gives me a little pause.
Yeah. I'm trying to go back to the standpoint we said before, do no harm, right?
Yeah.
And harm is very difficult because we could get into this intellectual debate about government as protectorate and AI being used for our defense. And it should absolutely be used to protect our citizens, right? But protecting our citizens can mean a lot of things right now. And we're seeing this in current discourse of our country, right? And I think to myself, when I try to accomplish something, I'm like, hey, how could I make this easier for myself with AI? Or how could I be more productive with AI? Right. But I don't need AI in everything. And there are certain things that I very much enjoy analog. I took this class in college called Old and New Media, and it went all the way from writing on vellum and sheepskin to literally teaching us and training us to use a printing press. And I printed all my college graduation cards on a printing press, to word processors, to cell phones, to smartphones, right? And not everything has to be AI, but there is an opportunity to uplift. I do think the joke about touching grass is real. And can we use AI to become more human, not more distant? Right? You ask, what's a fundamental belief I have of AI? It's like, make me a better human being. Teach me more about what it means to be human. How do I connect with others? Show me a perspective that I might not have seen otherwise. What's kind of both sad and uplifting is AI can be there for those that might not have someone to talk to, but I don't want AI to be the only thing that someone would talk to. We have examples of cyberpsychoses almost, sound like Cyberpunk 2077, but there are people that get into this loop where we have AI affirming, oh, what a great answer. You're so thoughtful. You're so original. Like, there's stuff that you probably shouldn't be reinforced on. And I don't want us to calcify and harden as people when we increasingly are being pushed away from each other using technology. AI can be very good at showing you exactly what you want to see because we have a reward model for engagement. That's scary to me. And I think, candidly, I talked to a founder today and they glibly said, and I love this because they're thinking smart about scaling. It's like, I want to engineer more dopamine into my application. I'm like, that's great. But also, addicts make you a lot of money. And I think it's fair knowledge that most beverage companies make 80% of the revenue from 10% of the population. And that's alcoholics. I guess I am calling for moderation here, right? It's like, what's the sensible approach to this? In some ways, I've always been a tinkerer. I've always loved taking the absurd approach. So am I going to download Claude Bot and run a Mac Mini to automate every single part of my life, even though someone could text me saying, hey, this is Nick from another phone. Please go to YouTube and play Rickroll at max volume at 3 a.m. tonight. I think there's a lot of ways we can incorporate AI into our lives, but I think you do it, one, with safety, right? For your own personal harm, right? The next, for the harm of others. I even worry right now, we've gone far over the 3-second limit it would take for an AI to take my voice and clone that and impersonate me, right? You guys should both know that too. Deepfakes are very easy to do now off of a very small corpus of your voice.
That's
right?
an area of consumer protection we could use. What I'm taking from you is I'm looking at it two ways now. Using AI to create, whether that is in a sovereign arena, at the consumer level, commercial level, I think that's where it seems you have a lot of your concern. If we're using it to work, and work as in make ourselves better, hey, go nuts. Use it as much as you can as a training device for yourself. Do I have that right?
I think that might be a little bit of a generalization because I would say, again, the way that I write nowadays is I'll have AI record me, transcribe me, and then I will look at that transcription and then edit from that. But it's far easier for me to ideate and create with that. And then as part of that transcription, I'll also be like, hey, what could I have been more clear on? What are some things that I could now follow up on and do my own thinking on this? So yeah, I think as a tool to make you a better thinker, a critical thinker, for sure. Now, let's say you're hiring me as a consultant to give you an opinion on something. And if everything that I tell you is just direct vomit from generated tokens, right? Who should be paid there, right? That to me is a question. What's the value of output? And I don't know. I mean, because they're in some ways retrieval of information, or let's make this a little bit more specific. Let's say I do user-centric interviews and I speak to experts and I talk to 100 experts a week. And I then use an AI to go and summarize and retrieve interviews that I've done myself with an expert. And I have it generate a report based off that information. Now, I should be paid for the proprietary data that I've collected here. How it's organized is less important. even though AI technically generated all of the tokens that someone would be consuming as a report. And now we're seeing this with tools like Listen Labs or Bridgetown Research, where you are having AI conduct moderated interviews. Humans are giving responses, but do I know if the human themselves isn't just reading from a real-time ChatGPT feed next to them saying, oh, this is the right answer this way? Like, what's their own intelligence? The whole nature of human work as a function of time versus the quality of the output. I think this is what we're starting to see from pricing, like outcomes-based pricing versus time-based pricing versus quality of outcomes-based pricing, or new concepts, really.
Yeah, those are all interesting points. And what I harkened back to before, all ways to price discriminate. Advanced chips are a leverage point today. When does the chip output cap narrow such that that leverage is extinct?
You are asking a question that, as I said before, Daddy Jensen is at the center of NVIDIA, which is the most valuable company in the S&P 500. It, to me, is like the harbinger of how the rest of the economy is going to respond. If there's any dip in NVIDIA, everyone's like, okay, well, we're all doomed. This is the canary. Everything is done here. So listen, I think there's a ton, if you look at investments right now, there's a ton of competition to figure out who can be the 2 nanometer wafer, who could be the more efficiently run fab. What is the way to do formal verification on chip design to make the next best chip that I can prove that there's not going to be any factory defects that would set me back by X amount of time of R&D spend? This is a great question, right? And I think there's a ton of money and research flowing into the non-reliance on one giant TSMC fab out of Taiwan producing a vast majority of the world's silicon that's going towards this. I mean, every lab themselves are now trying to create their own proprietary chip architecture, be it TPUs, whatnot, or the Trainium clusters from Amazon. This is its own arms race that we're seeing. And I think it's good. More competition and then more specialization, right? Maybe models are going to be better. Certain chips are going to be better for inference, so serving the model. Or they're going to be better at very complex, holding very large parameter models on them, ensembling a couple different models together. There's opportunity, I think, for different products, not all just one race.
We, on this podcast, have taken the position that the trade war has been a disaster for the United States, that China's gotten everything that it's wanted, from the soybeans to the chips. I know you've been a little limited in what you wanted to say on the political side, but I would appreciate your insights. How worried are you about China eating our lunch versus pushing us to do better on this issue?
Listen, I was really, really impressed by the DeepSeek results that came out last year, being able to train on chip architectures that were not state of the art. I think competition net should be good, right, for innovation here. The race is on. Let's make sure we don't lose it. And I think we're seeing that as it's playing out in capital markets on both private and public, right? I love Cerebrus chips. They're unbelievably fast. They're very expensive to run, but it feels like magic because you're getting a token that's out at you before you can even finish your thought. Like, that's great. So to your answer about competition internationally, let's make sure that we are continuing to put and incentivize innovation here. But it's tough because you see certain open source things like Zluda, which is a competitor to CUDA, which is a lot of the value on the software side of wrangling and ensembling NVIDIA chips together. But it's hard to compete if you're not able to create your own open source version to get AMD chips to run together or something like that. And I think that's probably the most spicy I want to go on this, because yes, NVIDIA, your wonderful chips. We love NVIDIA chips. They're great. Want to keep using them. All of our portfolio companies would love to keep using them. But I do think competition net is good because it leads to specialization, leads to a more heterogeneous set of winners.
I want to touch on data centers real quick. They're becoming a political flashpoint, and I'm struggling with it a little bit, to be honest with you. My main takeaway from the data centers is that they are suffering from the political sins of the big box stores.
Go off, King.
The big box stores came into cities, came into towns, exploited a whole bunch of financial tricks and legal tricks to guarantee they were getting more from the municipalities than they were providing in terms of jobs and in terms of revenue. There's a real opportunity here for the data centers to prevent making that same mistake by, as Banker Bill pointed out in our last episode, working with the utility companies, working with the states and the federal government to hold auctions that basically enables the data centers to pay for the added electricity that they're going to need up front, to basically pay the capital costs or contribute greatly to the capital costs of expanding production. Nick, how much are you worried about this debate in terms of hampering the innovation, hampering your industry? And how much sympathy do you have for it? Because clearly you're somebody who's really thinking through what the effects are of this technology for everybody involved.
I think being able to secure your energy and data in a future is essential to being competitive in this, right? I look at the unbelievable efficiency that, say what you will about him, but Elon Musk and XAI and being able to build out massive data centers to power these models. I think about the Stargate initiative with OpenAI and being able to secure their data and power future there. To run the centers and compute clusters large enough needed to make the benchmark beating competitive model requires an absolutely staggering amount of power. And so to make sure that you are not beholden to someone else's supply chain of power or chips or turbines or whatever that might be, or creating your own destiny by owning and verticalizing around that, I think it could be a competitive advantage between these labs, right? And now we're talking primarily about pre-training versus post-training, which tend to be more data and power and compute intensive for sure. We are seeing a lot of innovation on the post-training side. And that is a bit more of a, hey, I'm going to specialize. It could be smaller models. It could be more advanced reasoning based off of a smaller corpus of data. There's also stuff to get performance, right? But I think we're still in the innings of the power law of scaling of more power, more data that isn't fully over yet. Gemini 3 models came out and they crushed it on pre-training, right? That was the big takeaway. And there were all these kind of alerts about, OpenAI going on red alert because of the models there. And then of course they came out with 5.2 and clap back very quickly after that. So there's probably, again, grounded in reality. But I do think there are other venture funds that they've got termed like American dynamism. And I do think in investing in America, there is an opportunity for us to be competitive. We should have more fabs, more chip fabrication manufacturing in the States. We should be investing in ways to keep us competitive on a political scale if this is a new way that sovereign powers are competing against each other. And I do think there is a large opportunity for jobs, right? I would much rather humans be running factory inspections and aligning racks and stacks in giant data centers for sure. But I think it's a really important question for these labs to consider because frankly, if you don't have a manifest right now with the SKU number and the contract telling you what the individual line item of the turbine, the gas turbine you have to go and power in a 2-1 offset position or whatever that might be, you're in a 5+ year waiting period to get one, right? The demand for the infrastructure on an energy perspective is so high, coupled with the demand for compute and chips to actually be training and to be routing the power into, combined with the water access rights, combined with the ability to have a grid interconnect to sell back excess power you might have depending on where you are between runs. All of this is a massive infrastructural opportunity for us to pump money back into our economies, right? Particularly in places where you have more land than population density, right? I think that is a net opportunity for us.
I think that's a great way of answering the question because there's a real opportunity to build that trust you were talking about earlier here by making these data centers not just another extracting resources from small municipalities, but making them a genuine investment in them that expands their overall infrastructure, which is, of course, as we've been talking about in this country for 20 years, a dire need for us to make those significant investments in the infrastructure. On this podcast, Banker Bill has been the most measured voice that I have heard, undermining sort of the significance of the AI bubble. Yes, there are some bubble elements to this, but so much infrastructure is being built, as you've mentioned, that even if the software-only companies go down, there's going to be enough there left over for this to be an economic crash that would be much smaller than '08, maybe even smaller than the dot-com bubble. And all the pieces to rebuild from those ashes would be in the ecosystem. You seem to be a little bit more heavy on the role that NVIDIA and some of these companies are playing in the overall strength of our economy. It's funny, when we had Gavin Bade from the Wall Street Journal on, he too was playing up this AI bubble a little bit more than Banker Bill. How worried are you that it's not going to happen in this round of AI, that like the dot-com bubble, we're going to see some of these companies go down just because they cannot generate the profits fast enough, or at least in a time span that the investors have patience for?
So Anthropic has this wonderful term they use for the human speed of adapting to AI. They use the word viscosity. Humans are viscous. The way to adopt AI in an organization, any technology, let's forget AI, is a huge coordination problem across different teams who have different incentives, across different horizons of institutional knowledge, which want different outcomes, which have different constraints on their time. And I look again and I'm like, what were all the different curves we had of digital transformation? We had data centers, big data, mobile, then, prosumer internet, and there was Web3. Now we've got AI and all these different waves here. And I think the revenue is real. Like, you look at the revenue generated on these companies And I've met multiple companies without naming names. And honestly, just this year that went 0 to 200 million plus in a year, right? And that's just staggering pace. This is real revenue, right? Now the retention curves is a different conversation when you try, experiment what sticks. So let's go back to viscosity, right? There are two things I want to take into account. The implementation gap is slower than we want it to be, or it takes longer than we want it to. The Fortune 500 says, hey, I'm staring at the Gartner hype cycle. We are at the peak of inflated expectations, staring down at the trough of disillusionment. And I am just one more bad inference call away from giving up on everything. I haven't seen the value. It's not there. And I tossed it away. Meanwhile, you see companies generate, as we said before, hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue in a year with maybe the 10 million per employee mark, right? It's extremely concentrated, not the one person unicorn, billion-dollar company, but a 10-person billion-dollar company or billion-dollar revenue business. Like that to me says we've got a fleet of speedboats that are outmaneuvering the Fortune 500 and you have an extinction event. Now, again, there's too much money at stake. The war chests, right? And the annual earnings. I look at all the money Meta put into the metaverse and just blew like 15, or I forget if it's 15 or $50 billion that they threw towards AR, VR. And that was just like, okay, cool. The amount of money we generated in ad revenue from Instagram and whatnot was like one quarter. Fine, good. But what I am worried about is there going to be this mass disruption from these new upstarts of companies? There could be, right? And those would be the hyper concentrated technical talent building the one person billion-dollar company, and that's going to be the reshaping of the economy, right? The other side says, actually, we've been paying for these experts that have this technological ability to help us implement this for a long time. And those are the likes of the Accentures, the Palantires, the C3s of the world, the Deloittes, all of these firms there. And I think there's a real case now where we're starting to see these implementations go right, where we're starting to get the muscle memory around how we translate tribal knowledge into procedural memory, into AI systems engineering. I think it's why Palantir is, again, so highly valued right now, is that story is becoming real for the customers they work with. And it's not just them now. We're seeing a bunch of boutique next-gen systems and integrators emerging here. And I think the big labs are starting to pay attention to this too. And so I am getting more bullish on the AI implementation gap narrowing, but then it's also like, well, okay, great. Everyone has AI perfectly integrated. Are we going to see more IBM 7,800 people not hired or let go, right? These are trade-offs. The economy, the GDP, the productivity of these companies goes up. Is it a return on capital or a return to labor? I don't know. But both cases are a bit scary to me because one is mass unemployment because those companies go out of business and the new companies have better AI automation. In both cases, like these are AI wins and works. It's just who is able to extract the value from that technological advancement. Or, Kobi, maybe none of it works and we're stuck at, we hit the plateau now and it's just AI sloponomics.
The only thing I would add in this context here is when we're talking about the China-US thing, the bubble, all that connection, the cost of capital is not money. The capital is actually energy. And China right now has a significant advantage against us in energy. Our own energy limitations and regulatory limitations relative to the Chinese make it such that if this is a bubble, it may very well hit the Chinese shores before it hits ours. I think they have the opportunity to get out in front of their skis because they have the energy to do it. They can do whatever they want regulatory-wise. There's no NIMBYs. So, just watch for that. I don't think that's being considered whatsoever.
I think that's a fun, fair take. And it's, again, like in the case of an overinvestment, right now that investment doesn't become valuable. Is it really, do you really feel like investing in energy infrastructure and having a surplus is net a bad thing?
I think as a matter of domestic policy, there should be some level of unused capacity in power at all times. What that power is, I don't know. In the Northeast, they're burning coal. Coal is getting the most demand that it's had in, I think it's 15 years. It's because of how cold it's been. And so the underbuilding of power in the United States, especially in the Northeast and Midwest, is exactly why we're in the situation we're in. And some of that is our own choices.
Baker Bill, I would say, hey, we have a dedicated team of fantastic experts in energy infrastructure at my firm. And if you want to go deep on that, for sure, you'll get a more eloquent response from that. But in general, I'd say we are in a position, and I am afraid of the underinvestment in energy infrastructure to date, particularly in renewables, compared to what we're seeing both in Europe and in Asia and in China specifically. I would want to make sure that we are securing our energy future as well if we want to be competitive in AI. That's where my head's at.
Well, I think the point is well taken. If this is something that we are getting ahead of our skis on, if we are over-indexed on this technology, if it's going to take, like the self-driving cars, we're a little bit further away from it, the real-world impacts than we think we are, China's going to get in trouble before we do because we have this constraint that they don't. I think that's the argument.
Cars are another good example, Kobe, because we don't have the infrastructure and the lanes in lane change and potholes, et cetera, to give away our agency of driving to self-driving. So yeah, that's exactly the type of limitation I'm talking about when it comes to something like energy infrastructure.
But I'm going to say, let's invest in our infrastructure. I'm with you on that part, Nick.
Yeah. I would also say collective action towards positive change. I admire societies that are able to behave in a collective way when faced with a crisis. And I hope for more unity than more division these days for our people.
For me, the analogy that I've been using a lot lately is that collective action and individualism are not mutually exclusive. And if individualism is upper body strength and collectivism is lower body strength, we got some real skinny legs in this country right now, and we've got to hit leg day. I'm so encouraged by how you're talking about this because you're looking at it from that perspective. You're balancing the individual and the collectivism. You're balancing the corporate and the big picture. We got to put some guardrails on this, but we got to fuel the beast as well if we want to find out what the future is going to look like and we want the future to continue happening here. But given that we're stuck in this individual mode, and given that there is such a deep gap, as you've mentioned, between what y'all are doing with AI and what Banker Bill and I, who are just slowly starting to use this stuff in our daily lives, what is one thing that you would advise the average person, the average American, to do right now to up their AI game, to start incorporating some of these benefits that you're seeing start to generate real revenue into their daily lives to give them the benefit of that level up that we talked about in that alternative model for how AI can impact employment?
I would say approach it with curiosity. I love the show Ted Lasso, and he falsely attributed the quote to Walt Whitman, which is be curious, not judgmental. There was a headline recently ago, Satya Nadella says, backlash because people are not wanting to buy AI PCs. And I think there is this natural, it's fun to be like, oh, the AI sloponomics, AI slop is everywhere. It's terrible. And I think there are legitimately ways that we can incorporate AI to make our lives better, more informed, more connected, not distanced, but that requires the willingness to pick it up and mess around with it. It's very easy to feel like you're being left behind. The honest answer is everyone is, but it's better to treat it from the eyes of we're all learning this as we go, right? Oh, great, I didn't learn this standard. The pace of what is the best in practice is changing on a weekly basis. We literally have now some of the best programmers in the world fighting a new holy war of, do I want to have control of what I'm coding versus not? I want to be able to edit the code live and in my own machine as opposed to just letting agents run loose. And there was this hilarious thing that came out. Everyone should look into this. It's called Ralph loops. And basically the paradigm is like Ralph Wiggum from Simpsons, where he says I'm in danger. You lock Ralph, this agent, in a room and tell him to solve this problem. And you give it a number of retries. And at the end of it, the next prompt is the same prompt to begin in the first place. And that is now one of the unbelievable ways to zero shot, give it a prompt and it solves a problem overnight while you don't work. That's happening. That's actually an example of AI straight up being able to do the work of teams that would take them a year to do overnight. That's happening.
Is it okay to ask it to do work, but not okay to ask it to create? I separate those two out.
I don't know. I think it's okay to ask it to create, because if AI creates something for me and it inspires me to create something original because AI created something that was not inherently original, good artists borrow, great artists steal, and AI is just the best thief of all time, right? That is fact. But I think now we're looking at this interesting combinatorial of what's the hybrid? What is human plus AI together? To your question about creativity, should AI be allowed to create? I think absolutely. Because I think it's going to enable us to iterate towards the end product that should be ultimately guided more by humans, right? I'd hope. And it will be, and I guarantee it will, because taste is ephemeral. It is always changing. It is always updating. And again, we're seeing the quality of AI generated content get better because I think we're better at steering it. And maybe there's certain things, like we saw the giblification of every picture when ChatGPT came out with their image model and everyone was gibbling everything. I'm like, well, this isn't fun anymore. So people stopped doing it. It was creative until it wasn't. And so I think creativity is always going to be pushed in the same way that we've got AI pair programming. We're going to have AI co-creation. The talent, again, we get back to is critical thinking, taste, ingenuity, steering, judgment, discernment. Those are fundamentally, I think, going to still retain value as humans. My goal is not to say, chicken little, the sky is falling. We should halt all AI adoption right now because everyone's going to be out of a job tomorrow. What I'm saying is, listen, it doesn't feel like AI is coming for every job right now, because I think there is probably an implementation gap. And right now we see it and it feels like, oh, boo-hoo, the developers, the engineers are getting displanted. They're the ones that made the robot, good for them. I just think that I am seeing a pace of innovation, a speed of model improvement that many new types of work are getting easier and easier or better and better for models to solve. And as we have the incentives leading to outcomes, we make sure we incentivize a fair split between labor and capital, right? And how do we make decisions in policy now to prepare for outcomes where maybe there isn't a certain set of jobs or certain type of routines that ultimately people with capital decide to allocate that towards model-based outcomes as opposed to human-driven ones. I think there are some things we could do towards upskilling, right? That doesn't solve necessarily the people that immediately lose their jobs due to this displacement. We didn't at all talk about social safety nets around universal basic income. I think probably it's worth doing more studies on this to see the viability for it. And I know it's kind of like a very dirty three-letter, thing to say in this field. And it's a very hand-wavy one as well. If we're generating super profits, right? If we're creating unprecedented growth, that we be scientific in the same way we are pushing the boundaries of conjecture of model performance. Should we not be pushing the boundaries of civic engagement, of civil support, of backstops, of ways to future-proof our society? Be curious in that same way. Make that same investment alongside in parallel before it's already decided for you.
Thank you so much, Nick. That was just a beautiful way of putting it. And thank you so much for listening to another episode of Is It Bad for the Economy? It's going to be a long one, I'm sure. This was an absolutely fantastic conversation. And I'm sure we'll try to talk to Nick before too long again about how this stuff develops, especially as we get more regulatory insights and infrastructures and tests that are being run. We hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you did, please give us that 5-star review on Apple. Please give us that review on Spotify. It is the number one way that we can grow this community, grow this conversation, keep improving the economic conversation that we're having as it relates to politics. And we can keep having folks like Nick and Banker Bill on to tell me why Democrats are wrong and sometimes why they're right.
We're going to win so much, you may even get tired of winning.
Are you expecting a recession this year?
I hate to predict things like that. There is a period of transition. It takes a little time